This video was brought to you by the wonderful people on screen here who support me over at Patreon. If you want to support this channel and what I do, then please check the link in the description or the link at the end of the video. This episode's gonna have a long list of sources, so I hope you guys are ready to read. Because, as with anything, I would hope you guys fact-check me. That's why this channel's called Suris the Skeptic, not Suris the Atheist, or Suris the Lefty, or Suris the whatever. Anywho, today we're gonna be talking about crime and race. Because I never bring up any contentious topics on my channel, ever. Alright, so the first thing is that you may be wondering why this is a Dangers of Woo episode, considering that something about racism is more of a social issue. And the reason for that is that a lot of racism is actually rooted pretty heavily in pseudoscience. Or rather, most people who are racist end up finding pseudoscience that they use post hoc in order to justify their racism. If I can give two examples of this, one is the oft-used statistic that white Americans have on average an IQ of 100, and black Africans have on average an IQ of 70. Except the research that was used for that not only said nothing about the actual race of the people involved. That particular study has everything to do with the people in a region, not necessarily the race that they are. And the concept of race really just boils down to phenotypical expression, not cognitive function. But I'm going to end up doing an entire video about that later on. The one I want to focus on right now is this idea that race is somehow linked to crime. But before I get into that, let's go ahead and get the fan art out of the way, because a heavy-handed episode like this needs a little respite. First of all, we have the real Suris from Let's Alex. If anybody's seen my live streams, you know that's the plushie version. Then me next to Shattered Reaper by Shattered Reaper. And then finally, the Lord of Lewd himself makes my expression every time I deal with biblical gender roles. As usual, thank you guys for the fan art, and let's get into the meat of the video. So, have you ever actually heard this phrase before? Despite making up only 13% of the population, African Americans are responsible for more than 53% of the crimes. Chances are you've probably heard some variant of this before. But the real question is, why? Well, we can actually kind of dig into the meat of that. First of all, we have to get a few things out of the way. For one, for a crime to be documented, and therefore be part of the statistic, someone has to be caught in the act of that crime, or caught after the fact, or stopped before they could. This means that, in theory, if two particular streets were patrolled by 2 cops each, and 5 crimes were committed on both streets at the same time, then theoretically, there should be at least 2 arrests on both streets, meaning that if no reinforcements are brought into this thought experiment, at least 4 crimes will be reported, 2 on each street. These are the crimes that will be attributed to this statistic. If the other 6 crimes are not documented, the 3 that have gone unchecked on each street, then none of that will be accounted for in data. However, if we took the same number of cops and same number of crimes, but instead put 3 cops on Street A and 1 cop on Street B, there's now a potential of 3 arrests on Street A and 1 arrest on Street B. Even if the same number of crimes are being committed on both streets, if we can only catch and document more crimes on the first street because of heavier policing, then in data it would look like that street is responsible for 75% of the crimes between these 2 streets. This is just a quick and dirty thought experiment to show how over-policing in one area and lack of police representation in another can lead to an uninformed statistic. Now that we have the thought experiment out of the way, we have to actually figure out whether or not this is a thing that happens in real life. A thought experiment is only as useful as its application. So the question is, do we actually see over-policing in predominantly black neighborhoods, and thus more potentials for crimes to be caught and documented? Well, it turns out the problem is a little more complicated than just over-policing. One study, called The Impact of Race on Policing and Arrests, actually found that there was a higher propensity for white officers to arrest black citizens, but also found that the opposite was true. Black officers would arrest white citizens more often as well. I'll be linking that study in the description, as I always do, but what we can assume from that study is that if a white officer were to police a predominantly black area, it would be more likely that he would arrest people more often. And the converse would be true. From there, we would assume that if we had more white officers than black officers, then we would have more arrests of black citizens. It wouldn't be the only explanation, but it most certainly would be one valid one. The question becomes, how many white officers do we have compared to black officers in the force? Well, another study called Diversity in the Force, where police least don't mirror communities, found that black officers really only accounted for 10% of the police force on average, while white police officers made up over 60%. Now, in the meme that I said earlier, what was that percentage? 50% of the crimes? That seems to be the exact number disparity between white and black officers in their respective policing areas. But we still don't have a full case. That's only one set of meta-analysis on data and one set about population. Both of those studies will be in the description. So we have a little bit of data to show the difference in how often minority groups would be arrested and the possible whys. We don't necessarily have an underlying cause, but there are some steps to figuring that out that have been taken. As of 2019, another study called Racial Profiling in Searches, Did the Politics of Racial Profiling Change Police Behavior?, found that police behavior actually was changed quite greatly based on the media representation of different minority groups in their given areas. This meant if you lived in a predominantly racist area and the media reflected that, then you would also find a disproportionately high amount of arrests. Now, the only problem I have with this study is that it was centralized in North Carolina, so it's harder to expand that idea to the rest of the United States on the whole, unlike the study that was done by Yale, but it is one more drop in the bucket to show where the underlying problem is. So now in our case, we know that racial profiling not only exists within the police force, but it can be at least somewhat accounted for by measuring implicit media bias in the area. We also know that if you have a predominantly white police force, you're going to see a higher amount of black citizens' arrests. This is further evidenced by another study that I'm going to be providing in the description called Racial Bias in Police Investigations. This is one of the more recent studies I found, being from 2018, and it utilized traffic citations from car crashes, since it was one of the most non-random methods to determine whether or not police officers were generally arresting people who were races other than themselves. And what did that study find? Well, it found the same damn thing. It found that when officers were working crash sites, they were more likely to give tickets to people who were of another race than them. This was found amongst all races surveyed in the study, and it's a 37-page long study, so I hope you're ready for some reading. So again, all the numbers seem to pan out to mean one thing. On average, people of every race will arrest people who are not the same race as them. Therefore, if we have a majority of one race in the police department, we would expect to find that minority races will be disproportionately accounted for in crime statistics. And that is exactly what the data meets out. As for the argument of racial bias, is there a way we can measure that? Well, actually, yes. This is by utilizing something called the Stroop effect. The Stroop paradigm shows that there are going to be certain colors associated with words. For instance, when you think of the word blue, the color blue comes to mind and vice versa. It becomes very hard, then, to actually read the word blue if the word itself is colored orange. As a result, we can actually measure what colors people associate with certain words, like violent or criminal. And in chapter 28 of Social Cognition, we find a chapter called The Police Officer's Dilemma, using ethnicity to disambiguate potentially threatening individuals. Through using a variation of the Stroop effect that was modified to account for race instead of just colors, it was found that on average, every single police officer, not just white ones, saw that behavior from an African American, even if it mirrored that of a white person, was seen as more mean and threatening. This doesn't mean that the person of color was actually more threatening. This has everything to do with a schema that was already built in the person's mind, which correlates with the data that we found from the North Carolina study. And that media and outward influence, which is how we develop schemas in our mind, do in fact have an impact on how threatening a police officer finds any given individual. And that threat assessment directly correlates with the amount of arrests that we have. So now we know that this problem is at least twofold. On the one hand, we have more representation for white cops, which we know has a direct result on the amount of black arrests that will be happening. We also know that on average, thanks to the Stroop paradigm, there is a difference in color bias, which would further compound the problem that was shown from the previous data. Now, if you remember my previous point about throwing more officers into a particular street, leading to more arrests, and more importantly for the data, more documented arrests, there's a reason I brought that up. There's a concept called gentrification that has long since divided many areas of our country. In short, gentrification is the process of renovating or improving any house or district so that it conforms more to middle-class standards. Now, this is a bit of a problem considering that the middle class is a shrinking space in the United States. Now, while this sounds like a good thing on paper, you're increasing the value of any given living area, the problem is that people who are already living in that area are usually living right at their means, or slightly above or below. However, what was was found that in 2003 alone, over 200,000 renters were forced to move out of their neighborhoods because the neighborhoods had been remodeled into higher class versions. This ends up displacing many people if they can't afford the new rates. In Washington, D.C. alone, more than 20,000 African American citizens were displaced, and that was just in a 10-year span after the year 2000. 40% of all of their low-income neighborhoods ended up experiencing gentrification, which caused the displacement. Arrests and calls for investigations on African American citizens in D.C. increased so much that law enforcement in 2015 had to finally tell residents to stop calling on their black neighbors for mundane behavior. People were getting the police called on them for barbecuing outside, smoking, or even noise ordinances. I'll provide a news article for that, but suffice to say, the problem ended up being that predominantly white neighbors were calling on their black neighbors in a desperate attempt to get them to stop what they had been doing for decades. Stuff that was harming no one, and it was leading to a sharp uptick in arrests, all for mundane things. Because of these calls, predominantly African American areas that had been gentrified were becoming over-policed, and it was leading to a sharp uptick in crimes documented. And these crimes were usually of a very mundane nature, but they still end up being accounted for in the overall statistic. Please bear in mind what I said about the North Carolina study, however. You can't always expand this data to the entirety of the nation, so please take this part with a grain of salt. If we were to take the North Carolina study from before and use that as a small example to extrapolate from the rest of the nation and try to do the same thing with Washington, D.C., then we're getting an even clearer picture of why the crime statistic looks the way that it does. And this brings me to why this is actually a Dangers of Woo episode above anything else. It's long been hypothesized by race realists that there's a genetic component to crime, that these things start from the inside out as opposed to from the outside in. Hell, if you want a dystopian example of this, go ahead and read the Divergent series. This idea is literally everywhere, but that's the pseudoscientific part of it. There may be small genetic components like aggression that can be attributed to crime, but these components do not always necessarily correlate with racial structures. However, there are people that find themselves being incredibly racist and then finding data like the IQ study that I'm going to tackle in another episode, or the crime statistics across the United States, the 13 to 50 problem, and use that as a type of confirmation bias in order to assert that their racism was justified. Or the other explanation that I've heard many times is that statistics can't be racist. And you're right, statistics can't be racist, but the way that I've seen this employed has almost universally been to cite the statistic and then say, make of it what you want, when the person citing the 1350 statistic is speaking to a largely racist audience, or has said some racist talking points before and then says the statistic. While they may be saying make of that what you want, it's very clear what they're wanting you to make of it. To think that there's some genetic component to crime and that that genetic component is linked to black people somehow. But so far, we've only talked about the police force. There's a lot more to the justice system than just that. What happens after the arrest? Well, you know how previously I talked about how implicit bias actually allows racial profiling to proliferate? Turns out that that extends to every level of the justice system. In the Quarterly Journal of Economics, volume 127, there was a study called The Impact of Jury Race in Criminal Trials. It'll be in the description if you want to read it, but to summarize what was found, if you had a white jury, they were more likely to convict a black citizen, no matter what the crime was. There was a noticeable gap in convictions when a white jury judged a white person and a white jury judged a black person. But what happened when just a single member of the jury was black? Just one. Well, that gap ended up getting closed immediately, almost as if the racial bias was accounted for by having a member of that race as part of the judging squad. But then you might be asking if this is actually a right or left issue. If we ignore all the problems with how the Overton window is shifted over to the right in the United States, let's go ahead and take our classic right and left parties that we have here, the Republicans and the Democrats. We've already moved past the data of racial discrimination in the arrests and in the convictions, but what about the sentencing? Well, we did actually find that on average, black Americans were sentenced to about 3 months more prison time when a Republican judge was the one sentencing them. These are median differences and are actually found to increase the more discretion a judge is allowed. That's not me trying to paint all Republicans in a bad light, that's just me showing a point of data that shows that a lot of this bias seems to come from the right wing. And as usual, I will be providing that source in the description. But outside of the political aspect of it, what if we just look at the race of the people being sentenced in the first place? Well, let's take a single thing that is viewed by the majority of Americans America as a crime, marijuana use, and see what we find with that statistic. Well, as it turns out, the ACLU reports that white and black Americans both seem to use marijuana at the same rate, yet when it comes to arrest for possessions, black Americans are 3.73 times more likely to be arrested for possession. They generated this report utilizing publicly available census population data and arrest data. Now, in the article that I'm providing on that, this does lead us to another problem, in that there are politicians who are citing incorrect data to make this problem sound larger than it actually is. So let's break it down. Yes, there is a disparity in arrests in the United States, and on average, black citizens are treated worse by the judicial system. Every source that I've provided and every point of data suggests this. It also suggests that this is done without just cause, all basically boiling down to racial profiling and implicit bias. But when people inaccurately cite statistics, it ends up giving ammo to the race realists on the other side, because people who are doing their best to fix a problem in the United States end up doling out some exaggerated information and not supporting their side very well as a result. This is why, above all else, my channel is a skeptic channel. If I found data that suggested that there was not a racial disparity problem in the United States, then I would be providing sources on that. But instead, that's not what the data shows. But at the end of the day, what's the purpose of an episode like this? Well, it's basically a giant information dump that you can hold on to whenever you hear somebody cite the improperly used, despite 13% of the population meme. So, let me repeat it one last time. If someone is saying in an argument or just in conversation that despite making up only 13% of the population, black people are responsible for only 50% of the crime, and not offering any type of explanation further than that, they are, above all else, selling you woo, pseudoscientific nonsense used as a method of confirmation bias to allow race realists to justify racism. Anywho, I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Please, please, please check out all the references that I have in the description. I had to do a lot of reading for this one, but I hope the end product was worth it for you guys. If you guys enjoyed the video, please subscribe, please like, send it to your friends, all that good stuff. As always, everyone, insert end of video tagline here.